Comet. It's a short story published in 1920 by W.E.B. Du Bois. It tells the story of a comet's tail sweeping past the Earth, and because of the release of deadly gases, humanity is wiped out. At least it is apparently wiped out. The only survivors are a black man named Jim, who was in the basement vault of a bank, and a white woman, Julia, who was in her darkroom developing photos. Everyone else is dead. W.E.B. Du Bois is not known for his speculative fiction or his dystopian literature. The University of Berlin and Harvard-educated writer, sociologist, historian, and civil rights activist, who also helped found the NAACP, is most well known for his book, The Soul of Black Folks, and Reconstruction in America. But the very last chapter in a collection of poetry and prose essays called Dark Water, Voices from Within the Veil, includes this story, The Comet. And it's a fascinating story because it invites us to imagine what is actually necessary to bring about a complete overhauling of our status quos. And he thought about this a lot in his other writing. He thinks a lot about the ways in which it would really take some sort of apocalyptic event to break us out of the sort of structures that shape our world. And we'll see this as we go throughout the term. As we read 1984, you will see that even Big Brother's world seems to be an exaggeration of, or a natural outgrowth of, or a building upon things that are very much already in place in our world. Similarly, when we read The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead, you will see that the dystopia of the American South was very much a real thing, and that those very structures that we think we've outgrown actually completely shape our world today in all of their evil prescriptiveness. And when we finish the term with The Handmaid's Tale, you will see how the time before and Gilead and even the time after are expressions of the same sorts of status quos that control women's bodies and identities in profoundly damaging ways. So maybe Du Bois is right with his starting premise that the only way to fundamentally remake an evil system is to utterly destroy it in some way or other. And that's what he imagines in The Comet. And of course, there are two big structures that he wrestles with in this. One is race, and the other is gender. Because as I said, we are left with a black man and a white woman. As Saidia V. Hartman, professor of English at the University of Columbia, has noted, the idea of a black man and a white woman is a structural way for imagining equality in some sort of future world. White men and black women may create a biracial society, but that maps along particular power lines that are weighted with an incredibly awful cultural history of rape on the plantations and ongoing sexual aggression. As we know from listening to the stories of other people, from sociologists, from just being a wide awake person, to be a black woman puts you in the lowest position in society in so many ways and places so many expectations on you for somehow also fixing things. So this is why Du Bois does not imagine a white man and a black woman, but rather a black man and a white woman. Because as we also know, white women have incredible power in society, and they have frequently weaponized that power against black men, against other women, all in the name of securing more power for themselves. But even in doing that, they are frequently also participating in structures that render them powerless. And so for this reason, Du Bois has his two survivors, be a black man and a white woman, to imagine this sort of structural equality. Through the course of the term, we're going to look at 5 kind of recurring ideas that structure dystopian fiction: freedom, power, survival, goodness, and love. So I want to think briefly about how each of those manifest in this story that you're reading. So first of all, freedom. Freedom is interesting in this because we don't get a lot of time to see how the world would develop post-apocalyptic New York with only our two survivors, Jim and Julia. But what we do see is that freedom is only possible with apocalypse. that somehow true freedom will take a fundamental undoing of the order of the world as it is. And of course, this reality comes in so hard at the end of the short story, right? Because it turns out it was actually only all of New York that died. People in other places were absolutely fine. And at the end of the story, Julia's father and her fiance come returning amid all sorts of cries of concern, and instantly the status quo reappears. Despite the fact that for one glorious moment, Julia had imagined the possibility of a world where race was not what it is in our world. She saw Jim as a man, a strong, kind, capable, loving man. She saw him as someone who bore the image of God. But then the car comes, and there's the honking, and there's the fiance, and Jim is paid after his character is impugned, and everyone is so concerned that perhaps he had done something inappropriate to Julia. The status quo can return all too easily. And so in this story, freedom is imagined as only possible with some sort of apocalyptic event that destroys the status quo completely. Power in this story is also interesting. Obviously, the power of white America and also the power of men in this story is assumed and woven throughout in so many ways, but really power is in nature. Nature seems to be the one thing, the only thing that has the possibility of undoing the structures that we have built, right? There's going to be no way to do it ourselves. It's going to take a comet, is what Du Bois is suggesting, that for all the banks and high-rises and automobiles and airplanes and rockets that we build, the real power is in nature. And it's the only power strong enough to bring freedom. What about survival? Survival and the need for survival actually becomes a really generative question in this story. In some of our other stories, survival will force our characters into really awful choices. But in this case, the need for survival becomes the opportunity to question the assumptions and practices of the status quo. Suddenly, Julia is able to see Jim as someone who bears the image of God and who also might be able to help her repopulate the world. And this becomes a really interesting thing, right? Because survival also, in as much as it opens up the possibility of a new humanity that Jim and Julia form together, it also reinscribes certain identities in really profound ways. Jim is to become the father of the nations. Julia is to become the mother of the nations, and these identities start to become primary when survival is at stake. It's interesting because one of the things Du Bois draws to our attention is that, in fact, when survival is the question, two things become really important. Well, one thing really, making babies. You've got to have children if you're going to survive. Because survival is more than just about the human being, the single human being. It becomes about everyone. The status of the species. This idea will come back to us in horrible ways at the end of term in The Handmaid's Tale. What about goodness? Where do we see goodness in this story? Well, there's a lot of goodness here, actually. One of the things that we see straight up is that as soon as everyone is dead, there's a lot of room for kindness, right? In that, at first, we see Jim's mistreatment. It's very, very subtle. But the ways that he narrates his own experience, he knows that no one valuable will be sent down into the basement. He knows that no one looks at him kindly or expects well of him. And in fact, as readers, we're not told that he's Black until midway through the story. But there's all sorts of ways in which it's pointed to and suggested in not only his treatment by other people, but his own self-narration. But after the cataclysm of the comet, goodness becomes possible not just in action, but in the ways that Jim is able to think about himself and the ways that Julia is able to think about him and herself. It takes a bit, though, for Julia. She does have one very awful moment where she runs away, assuming the worst, where all of her conditioning, All of her training, all of the things she has been taught to believe, and all the things that she has allowed herself to believe come crashing in, and she goes running down the street from Jim, scared. But after that, there seems to be a sort of conversion where she realizes, no, there is a lot of goodness here in this man, in me even, maybe, possibly. Keep your eyes out for how goodness manifests itself in the small ways in these stories we're going to read, in those little cracks and crevices, and then in big heroic ways too in the Comet. And finally, love. As with so many of our stories, love is going to be the hardest thing to find, because when we imagine our worlds in their worst possible states, one of the first things that seems to evaporate in the imagination of our authors is love, or at least love as we know it. Love as we have been taught to think about it and talk about it goes away. And there's really no time for love to develop in this story. It ends very quickly. But we do see Jim's love for his wife and his child and the baby hat that he takes from his home, and as he goes running to the woman at the end carrying the dead child in her arms. I think that moment's really important because it highlights that whatever love is, whatever hope there is, that it is somehow centered in this very particular thing of the family and children in particular. And we're going to see that over and over again in our stories. Keep an eye out for the role of children in these stories because it's important. In some ways, we could say that it's not the nuclear family that is the core of these stories, but that somehow children are the nucleus of love in these stories, or one of the profound ways that we see love appearing in good ways, in ways that are a lot less problematic. Well, maybe not so much in 1984, but you'll have to see what you think of the Parsons children in that one. So enjoy the Comet this week. Think about how these themes work their way through. And as you do that, pay very careful attention to the ending. The language is awful. The behavior of the people returning from the countryside is appalling. Notice the human dignity in Jim's response. Notice Julia's discomfort, but her acquiescence. And consider this question. Who are you in this story? Where do you stand at the end of the story? With Julia? With the fiance and father? With Jim? With Jim's wife? Where do you stand in this story?